Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's third workshop that will explore trends and expectations surrounding the outlook for energy markets. Today, we will discuss electricity markets. We're very excited to have several distinguished panelists joining us. Thank you to them for agreeing to be here and sharing their thoughts and insights. These workshops are very important to EIA, and we are joined today by both our Administrator, Linda Capuano, and Deputy Administrator, Steve Nally. My name is Chris Namovich. I'm the lead analyst of the EIA's Renewable Electricity Analysis Team. EIA is a statistical agency within the United States Department of Energy. Our mission is to provide independent and impartial data and analysis that can be used to better understand how energy markets function and make more informed decisions. I want to review a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar. A link to both the recording and presentations will be sent to all participants once it has been uploaded to EIA's website with closed captioning. To avoid background noise, all attendees have been placed on mute. There will be a Q&A period for each session. Well, there's only one session here. You may submit your questions at any time using the chat function in the WebEx control panel. Please make sure you direct your questions to all panelists. We will do our best to follow up with you on any questions which we do not get to today. Also, I want to thank Kelsey Brasher and Richard Bowers of EIA for helping to monitor and run the WebEx and Q&A here today. This has been an unusual and extraordinary year, with energy markets seeing severe shocks from both the supply side and the demand side. Electricity is a critical commodity in our economy and society and has been caught in the middle of these shocks. At EIA, we, like many others, are developing new approaches to gather information and estimate the direction and scale of market changes. These workshops are one way for us to better understand the dynamics we are observing. Our workshop today will feature 4 panelists, each providing a different perspective on how electricity markets have been impacted and how we might expect these impacts to play out over both near and midterm horizons. I'll give brief bios before introducing each panelist for a quick overview, but just so everybody knows, Christine Tezak, Ethan Zindler, Chris Pylong, and Justin Baca are 4 speakers. So going to Christy, she's the Managing Director at Clearview Energy Partners, where she leads Clearview's electricity markets, interstate pipelines, energy structure, and U.S. environmental policy coverage, using her more than 2 decades of experience in the electric utility and natural gas pipeline sectors. Prior to joining Clearview, Christy was a senior research analyst at Robert W. Baird & Company and a senior vice president with the Washington Research Group. She has testified before FERC and the U.S. House of Representatives and has served 8 terms as a board member of the Washington, D.C.-based Women's Council on Energy and the Environment. Ms. Tezak holds a bachelor's degree in Russian from Boston College and an MBA in finance from the George Washington University, and we are pleased to have her today for her to present her insights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you for having Clearview with you today. Just a couple of comments to start off, the conversation here. The COVID experience has been an unusual one for the power sector, in no small part because it is, a sector that is underpinned by incredibly long-lived investments. And so fluctuations in demand, such as those occasioned by the shutdowns of the economy in response to attempts to control the coronavirus, are unusual in that respect. And they have played out in some very interesting ways. One of the things that we have successfully weathered so far, particularly from the electric utility perspective, has been the reflection of this unusual economic condition in the capital markets. There were concerns that short-term credit would be hard to come by or particularly expensive. The Federal Reserve was intervening to help manage that impact, not only for the electric utility industry, but for corporations in general. And this, I think, was substantively successful insofar as there was a there were a couple of weeks where things looked a little iffy, but the access to capital for the regulated utilities has remained unfettered, in the words of Moody's, and that is certainly constructive and good news for customers. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is that that particular environment is colored by the regulatory outlook. The reason the utilities tend to trade inverse to market conditions, meaning when as defensive stocks, when the market's really ripping, the utility sector tends to not reflect that much of an uptick, and usually when the markets are strained, then there is what is referred to as the flight to quality, where folks who normally don't invest in utilities may seek to hide their money, if you will, in something that they perceive to be more stable, and certainly regulation is an area that is perceived to be more stable. With the requests by policymakers, starting from the U.S. Congress and all the way down through the states, that utilities forbear the unpaid bills while the economy sorts itself out, and while unemployment benefits were sorted out, and while the strategy for reopening was developed. This is something that creates regulatory risk for the utility sector, and so we have seen this reflected in more volatile equity prices. In fact, the U.S. utility sector tends to trade at what is called a beta to the market and of about 0.4 to 0.5 when you assume that the market itself is 1.0, and now it is above 0.7 to about there's a couple of utilities that are on par with the market at 1. And what that implies is an assumption that two things. It implies that there's probably a likelihood that those unpaid bills get addressed in some fashion, perhaps not to 100%, but that the regulatory lag will sort that out and the utilities will remain healthy. However, given that the visibility is a little cloudy and that we haven't worked through all of the regulatory mechanisms of working that out, there is more risk associated with investing in the electric utility sector than there has been in the past. That said, you compare that to other industries that have been a lot more adversely impacted. The first one to think of is oil and gas and pipelines. They're off, since before the pandemic, about 36% since the beginning of the calendar year, whereas utilities are only about down 13%. So still an inverse correlation with the market, but definitely a softer fall, if you will, compared to what we have seen in other components of the energy sector. More broadly, again, because decisions on a regulatory basis take time and don't respond to short-term impacts as quickly as the markets do, we are seeing lower demand associated with primarily lower commercial and industrial demand, although that is recovering. We have seen an expansion of greener resources in the market. So far as they have been producing, but lower demand levels have implied more market share for them in the recent months. That likely will change as demand improves. And we did see a lower emissions over the first 6 months of the year than we would have seen otherwise, but primarily that's driven by lower demand and greener resources than any other exogenous circumstances. So those are the things we're seeing from our perspective there at Clearview, and I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Thank you. So next up, we have Ethan Zendler. Ethan is the head of the Americas branch of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a provider of insight, data, and news on energy, advanced transportation, commodities, and emerging technologies. He manages analysts and commercial teams in New York, Washington, San Francisco, and Sao Paulo, while also overseeing ClimateScope, a project profiling clean energy conditions in developing countries. He joined BNEF in 2005 as its first U.S. employee and has held several positions within the group. Prior employment includes stints at the Cape Cod Times, the White House, and MTV. Ethan is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Energy and National Security Program, and holds an MBA from Columbia Business School and a BA from Georgetown University. Ethan?
Thanks, Chris, and hi, everybody. It's a lovely spot out here in my little backyard, which was quiet until a moment ago when a freight train decided to go by. So my apologies, but I'm just going to press on. So first, thanks for having me today. As was mentioned, Bloomberg NEF is a division of Bloomberg that does energy market research, and we've been basically doing it for about 15 years. We tend to focus on the energy transition writ large and the belief that the systems are fundamentally transforming and decarbonizing as we move forward. So I'm going to make a few comments, and I'll really build largely on what Christine had to say. I think I really pretty much agree, but hopefully can fill in a few more blanks as I go. As we look across the power sector in the U.S., I mean, obviously the entire economy has been dramatically affected by COVID, with retail activity at one point in the year being down perhaps as much as 70%. And vehicle use being off as much as 70% during certain times of the year, particularly April looked like it was kind of the nadir in terms of economic activity. We're obviously still seeing it. We've seen quite a rebound, but still things are tracking, probably 10 to 20% below in terms of overall energy use, but that's just totally very early guesstimate at this point. I'm going to talk just though for a few minutes though about renewable generation, and I'm also going to talk about demand overall. And I'm going to start first by just a few quick thoughts on electricity and demand. First is to note that one of the things that we at Bloomberg NEF have done is to try to look at the actual consumption versus what consumption would have been under some kind of a BAU circumstance, which is not an easy thing to do. You have to factor in weather and other things like that, days of the week. It's not sufficient, I think, in our view, to just compare electricity consumption this year to last year. There are different factors at play at all times. But based on that, very simply, and vastly oversimplifying things, we think that U.S. consumption of electricity through the end of September was only about 3% below what you would have expected under BAU. And that's really not a very big difference given what we've seen in terms of a drop in demand for road fuels. April and May, we saw some dramatic declines at various times, but a lot of that has bounced back. And one of the main reasons, of course, is that while we've definitely seen lower demand from the commercial and industrial segments for electricity, residential demand has gone up. One hasn't entirely offset the other. But it certainly played a major role in making sure that the total amount of electricity consumed has not been down all that much overall. The impact on pricing, as you might also imagine, on wholesale prices is that wholesale electricity prices were down through the first half of the year. Anywhere from 10 to 20% is a reasonable range, depending on what HUD you're talking about around the U.S. But basically, wholesale prices have been under pressure in the U.S. anyway, from proliferation of cheap natural gas and renewables, and this year really only compounded that situation, to a fairly substantial degree. When we think about actual clean energy builds for this year, we do our projections twice a year. Our last one was in April, and we're going to do another one in another couple of weeks. And at the moment, our view is that we think about 25 to 27 gigawatts of new wind and solar are going to get built in the U.S. That's actually up a bit from what we were saying in April, which of course was kind of at the darkest moment of in terms of thinking about where the economy was going. For wind, we think we'll probably see about 13 to 14 gigawatts built this year. And solar will be somewhere in the range of 12 to 13. And I'll break that down by segment in just a second. But the reason why we were pretty pessimistic earlier this year is because at the height of some of these outbreaks, it was pretty uncertain what the shutdowns, lockdowns in different states was going to mean for actual activity around construction. And then we saw outbreaks in some manufacturing plants. And the picture didn't look good. But actually, in many cases, a lot of activity has continued on. And just generally speaking, on the utility scale side, the level of interruptions has not been particularly high. So that brings me to solar, where for solar, we're expecting about 9 gigawatts will be built in utility scale solar, up from about 7.5 last year. And that's a segment that has really has done fine, more or less, given the current circumstances. Where there's been more challenge has been around distributed generation, distributed solar, in particular commercial and the C&I sector for solar, where the number will probably be down a bit from last year. And on the residential side, probably at the end of the day, somewhere around where it was last year. A lot of factors at play here. Obviously, when we really went into lockdown and no one was allowing anybody into their homes, and that was really the worst for the residential solar sector. But over time, things have obviously loosened up a bit, and actually, a lot of us are spending a lot more time, here at home, and thinking about ways that we can improve the places that we live, and that is, I think that's actually been beneficial to the sector. So net will probably end up more or less where we were last year in terms of installations. At least that's our early estimate for 2020. I'm going to finish by just saying a couple quick things which sort of echo some of the stuff that Christine was saying. But overall, for the year, we think that electricity will be down a bit. Some of the trends that we've seen over the last 10 years will certainly continue, maybe exacerbated this year when we look at the final numbers, with natural gas up, probably topping 40% of generation from about 38% last year. Renewable energy generation could top 20% this year, including large hydro. And then maybe most notably, the coal numbers continue to really decline, and coal total generation could fall below 20% for 2020 when all is said and done. And when you add all that up, which is lower total demand and cleaner demand, then that obviously has very, very positive impact on reducing CO2 emissions. We could see emissions drop from the power sector back to some kind of level from the 1980s or maybe even before by the time all said and done. Obviously, another quarter to go, and we'll have to see what the weather's like and a lot of other things. But the decline has been dramatic. And one thing that does seem certain, obviously, is that the power sector will continue not to be the number one source of CO2 emissions in the U.S. That title will continue to be held by transportation. But it's actually possible that when all is said and done, that the power sector will become the third largest source of emissions behind industry and transport. So that's some of the stuff that we're watching as we look to round out the year in January and trying to understand what happened and what has been certainly an eventful and crazy year. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Chris. I'm happy to take questions when we get to them.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. Next, we're going to have Chris Pylong. Chris works as the Director of Operations Planning for PJM and is responsible for the Transmission Operations Department, Generation Department, and Outage Analysis Technologies Departments. These departments perform near-term transmission outage analysis and approvals, generation outage analysis and approvals, and annual Black Start unit commitments, as well as gas-electric coordination, near-term load forecasting, solar forecasting, and wind forecasting. Previously, Mr. Pylong was responsible for the oversight of the dispatchers that operate and maintain the reliability of the PJM portion of the Eastern Interconnection. Prior to that, Chris worked as the manager of the Reliability Engineering Department at PJM, performing day-to-day transmission outage analysis, as well as real-time coordination of grid activities with neighboring RTOs and ISOs. Chris has a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering from Lehigh University and a Master's of Business Administration from Villanova. And over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris, and I guess good afternoon and good morning for some people, depending upon where you're dialed in from today. So glad to be here, give you guys a bit of insight from the PJM perspective on the impacts from COVID. Before I get into that, though, just to touch briefly on PJM, if you're not familiar with us, we're operating the power grid as well as clearing the markets from a day-ahead, near-term, and sort of longer-term capacity perspective for an area of the grid, the Mid-Atlantic, really ranging from New Jersey straight across all the way through to northern Illinois, and then down through Virginia. It's about 65 million people, 180,000 megawatts or so of generating capacity, and then varying load forecasts, which we'll talk a little bit about here, that help us clear some of the various markets that we have. I'll touch first on some of the near-term impacts that we've been seeing. So similar to some of the prior comments, we have absolutely seen a reduction in the demand from a result of the pandemic. And those reductions have sort of shifted over the last several months here. As everybody is fairly well aware, or if you're not well aware, New Jersey, New York City, which is not part of the PJM territory, but those sort of surrounding areas were very initially outbreak areas, hotspots from the virus. So we saw some pretty significant and rapid closures of businesses, schools, really having everybody working from a remote telecommuting perspective back in the March timeframe. When we look at the spring time period, is a time period of more moderate load or system demand, we saw about a 10 to 12% reduction in the peak each day, as well as about a 10% reduction in the overall energy. So when you think about the use over the full 24-hour period of the day. So those are the reductions that we saw in the spring. As we moved into the summer time period, the reductions really kind of dampened out. What we really saw was once the heat moved into the territory, the humidity, the air conditioner load really picked up. We also did start to see some of the restrictions ease, but really more of a function from the air conditioner loading. The reductions were not as significant, so it was down from on a peak perspective, about a 3% reduction than we would normally expect given similar weathering conditions, and about a 5% reduction in the energy usage on those summer days. We're just starting now to get into our more moderate fall temperatures. It's now got into the upper 60s and 70s. We're not seeing the air conditioner loading. We are seeing again a bit more of an impact from the pandemic, but with further reopenings of businesses, many schools either doing hybrid sessions with some virtual, some in class, or some going into full in class sessions. We've seen now that our demand reduction is about the 7% from a peak perspective and 5 to 7% on energy. So the sort of impacts kind of ebbed a bit in the summer, and they are coming back here again in the spring. The winter will be interesting to see how that's impacted. So from a kind of a tie back into some of the market perspective, from a day ahead market, which we're clearing, making sure we have enough capacity cleared to run for the next day to meet the demand, as well as our real-time pricing, we haven't seen significant impacts to the clearing prices. And as sort of previously mentioned, a lot of that is really because the geographic area where PJM is located is sort of right on top of the Marcellus Shale. So there is an abundance of very cheap natural gas, and natural gas tends to really set the clearing price for our generation and sets the clearing price across our markets in day-ahead real-time perspective. So that's really what sets the price, and there really hasn't been too much of a change there. But again, with a net reduction of energy usage, there is a net reduction in the overall market. Shifting gears a little bit now from a kind of a longer-term perspective, what are we thinking the impacts are really going to be? So, as I mentioned, we've been seeing, about especially over the peaks, which is what we use for clearing our longer-term capacity market. When we look at the peaks over the next several years, they're based on a summer peak. We are seeing that they're down, and we're basing our forecasts off, in particular, economic data. So Moody's economic data is showing reduction to the GDP, which is going to have a reduction to businesses and a reduction to the overall demand for the system. So we're looking at, for 2021, about a 1% reduction in our summer demand. We'll see how the pandemic plays out, so these numbers can obviously change. By 2022, that impact is down to about 0.5%. So when I say 0.5% impact, we had an original forecast for 2022 of about 151,000 megawatts for a summer peak, and we're down now at about 150,000 megawatts as a summer peak. And based off of the projected economic recovery by 2025, we see that we are back to sort of a non-pandemic influenced load forecast. So from a market clearing perspective, they're not huge megawatt amounts, and they are showing sort of a shorter term impact, which would, from a longer term investment in new generation resources, not expecting there to be a significant impact there sort of either way. and maybe a few earlier generation retirements than otherwise would have materialized if they were sort of on the cusp of retiring. But other than that, not seeing any significant potential differences for the longer term there either. So I will stop there, turn it back over to Chris, and looking forward to questions.
All right, thank you, Chris. Finally, we have Justin Baca. Justin is the Vice President of Markets and Research for the Solar Energy Industries Association. He manages SEIA's market research and policy analysis portfolio, which he helped build over the past 12 years, and includes the quarterly U.S. Solar Market Insight, SEIA's major solar projects list, Solar Means Business, cooperation with partners, and solar workforce analysis, and frequent policy analyses. Since 2015, he has managed SEIA's codes and standards work, which focuses on the building, electrical, and fire codes and product standards that govern the mechanics of how solar projects are permitted and constructed in the U.S. Justin also oversees the PV recycling work and expansion of SEIA's workforce development initiatives with partner organizations. Justin holds a Master's of Public Administration from the Maxwell School and a BA in Government from Cornell University. And welcome, Justin. It's yours now.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris. So, I mean, I agree with a lot of the comments the other folks have made here. You know, this is everyone's first pandemic, and we're all trying to learn a little bit about epidemiology and how this is going to impact everything going forward. So I like to start reminding myself that as much as I think I have learned in the past few months about how things might play out, I fully expect additional curveballs. So everything has higher error bars on it now. But I'd like to start off by talking about sort of the material impacts earlier on. So starting in March, when we had lockdowns in California, New York, Washington State, and spreading to broader parts of the Northeast and then Atlantic and then elsewhere, we started seeing very significant stoppages in particularly residential solar installations. And so this is because these activities were either considered non-essential or were considered to be non-essential once the work had finished, and you couldn't start a new project. And so the nature of residential solar installations is that sometimes they can be constructed in as little as one day. So it's pretty easy to finish up that work and then not be able to start a new project. And so very quickly we heard about, solar companies laying off, their entire staffs. And, coming into to May, we estimated that tens of thousands of solar employees had been laid off at that point, probably totaling a 40% reduction from where we had expected solar employment to be at that time before the pandemic. And so it's pretty substantial. And in the end, we saw what turned out to be about 25% reduction in residential installations in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. And the first quarter was already somewhat impacted just in the last month there in March. So it's a pretty substantial impact. Now, we have started to see a return where, since the lockdowns have been eased and we're moving into progressively more open phases in different states, people are getting more comfortable with certain activities, and a lot of solar companies are actually reporting pretty strong demand. And this would be a combination of impacts from, I think what Ethan said, people are spending more time at home, they're using a little more power at home, they're looking around and seeing what things they can fix. So there's some of that. In California, we have people being at home and facing the prospects of public safety power shutoffs, and that's having an impact on demand for battery backup with solar systems. And so there, on the demand side, there's still a lot of interest, but we still have lingering issues on the labor supply side, where while most solar workers have come back, some have declined to come back because maybe they've got kids at home now and kids aren't their kids may or may not be going to school full time. And so some people are making decisions there to hold off on returning to work or maybe working part time. Just as, virtually everyone has experienced at some level or another over the past 6 months. And also, companies are wary of hiring new employees with only so many months left in the year to bring those employees up to speed, ensure quality control, and then facing a step down in the investment tax credit on January 1st, and not knowing what that will mean for their ability to maintain those new employees. No one's interested in hiring people and then letting them go right away. So, a lot of companies are working full out right now with the employees they have, but with a lot of uncertainty. I'll say some other things that have impacted the industry since March is, permitting departments shut down as well. And so this was something of a really sort of mixed bag for the industry, and I think for other industries as well. And that is that a lot of permitting departments, and there's over 15,000 individual authorities having jurisdiction in the U.S. that oversee building permits, electrical permits, and such. A lot of them have been working with paper since forever. And suddenly in March, a lot of them became very willing to accept applications via email. They were processing stuff via email. They quickly looked to find out how they could process stuff online. And many were actually doing inspections remotely, where, construction workers out there with their phone using FaceTime or Skype and saying like here's the electrical panel and here's the flashing on the roof penetrations. And we actually may see some material improvement in the permitting and inspection processes going forward. And so while it was very disruptive for a month or so, a lot of building departments have figured things out. And so that's something where it's kind of a forced evolution of sorts for the way the industry does business. Similarly, the way that residential solar systems are sold has moved mostly online now, almost entirely online. And there are a lot of expectations that that's going to be a fairly durable thing. We're going to see fewer, like door-to-door sales or, sales in retail outlets. We'll see some of that come back for sure, but a lot of companies have found that there's some cost savings to be had there, which can improve their competitiveness. Another thing that we're still trying to work out how exactly it's going to impact the industry, but it doesn't look good right now, is that the overall impacts on financial markets. While some of the largest banks that provide tax equity for utility scale solar systems and for third-party owned distributed generation systems, the largest ones are still financing projects to a certain degree. Some of the marginal providers of tax equity have dropped out. And so what we see here is a potential for projects that were on the margin to perhaps become unfinanceable very soon if they haven't already, failed to secure tax equity financing already. And so there are policy asks that we have out there to address this and are working with Congress. But as of right now, there is uncertainty looking into 2021 and 2022 in particular about the level of installations that will ultimately be completed based on their ability to secure tax equity financing. That said, I think, Ethan had mentioned that some of the forecasts had gone up a little bit, and that's something we agree with on the out years that, 2023 has some upside potential if the financing works out. This is sort of just the industry evolving on the price side faster than previously anticipated, but with the downside potential from the overall financial markets. I will say though that the physical build out of utility scale solar has been mostly undisrupted by the pandemic. For the most part, started projects were allowed to continue in every part of the country, with some mild exceptions in New York, and we found that both the utility scale and residential and commercial rooftop systems that, you know, a lot of this work, you know, is done outside. It's done in the field. It's done on rooftops, and it's a pretty safe form of work. And so, you know, our hope is to build on that and expand the solar industry going forward as a source of good, safe jobs, while other parts of the economy may have a harder time recovering in a safe way. And so, overall, I would say, you know, it's definitely going to be a rough year for the distributed generation sector of the solar industry. And, you know, we had expected it to be a record year for distributed generation, but it is going to be down. We will see overall growth this year, but it is entirely due to the previously anticipated large ramp up in utility scale solar systems. And a lot of that was based on getting systems done shortly after securing a commenced construction provision under the investment tax credit. I think we're good. Looking forward to questions. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you, Justin. So one thing I think I heard in a number of presentations I wanted to throw it back to the panel is, you know, maybe there is a bit of a silver lining in this in general for the power sector and especially for clean technologies, in that in the last recession that we had, you know, 10, 12 years ago, it was basically a collapse of the financial sector, and that made financing anything really difficult. But here, although Justin did mention that, you know, certain marginal tax equity players might be a little bit in a little bit of trouble, it's a collapse of demand, but that the power sector is in some respect a little bit insulated. The demand for electricity, as we see, is down a little bit, but not a whole lot, especially when you look at like the capacity markets. Is it perhaps possible that a silver lining in this is that there's more equity available, more investors, finance available, interested in sort of getting onto this lifeboat in a very rough economic storm? And I'll throw it out, I guess. Christy, you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. Well, it depends. I think that in some ways we haven't really seen the proverbial lifeboat materialize. Certainly not in the form of the wonderful hulking ship that appeared in the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act in 2009. And in fact, so far to date, in looking at what Congress has been contemplating in terms of overall economic stimulus, the energy sector hasn't been particularly successful in getting a big shot in the arm from that respect. But that is something that could arguably change depending on the outcome of the election. Certainly the House of Representatives is very focused in integrating a green energy component into any economic stimulus that is going to help the country move forward from this particular economic disruption. And certainly we would expect that if Joe Biden were to succeed President Trump, and particularly if the Democrats succeed in turning the Senate blue. So I think that, in terms of really materially sized lifeboats, that is something that would still loom on the horizon. I think that what we could see in the very near term is a bit of a distraction in terms of state policymakers being more focused on areas of their economies that are struggling versus necessarily jumping on board with moving significant policy initiatives. That said, the fact that we are going to see an expansion of market share for renewables in the data that will wind up materializing by the end of 2020 may provide some wind at the proverbial back of policymakers to take the calculated risk that further raising their renewable targets or accelerating their net zero objectives is something that is worth contemplating, and that is something they can do and that they may need to do in order to sort of keep deployments rolling, as opposed to seeing them sort of stall out a little bit while demand recovers. So I think we see a little bit of a mixed bag near term in terms of soft policy issues that could change, and that, should we have a shift in the alignment of power here in Washington after the election, we could see something more substantive along the lines of the very focused and very robust stimulus for the clean and green technologies in the electricity space, akin to that which followed in 2009.
Okay, thank you. Ethan, you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I agree with Christine. I mean, certainly back to your original question, which is that, in terms of thinking about silver linings, I think Justin certainly identified one. If in fact we're now seeing expedited permitting. The U.S. traditionally has had some of the highest non-equipment costs for distributed solar installations in the world. Frankly, a lot higher than Germany and elsewhere. So anything that can help reduce those costs, I think, will make it more competitive in the long run. I suppose another piece of silver lining is, maybe we do have more, more people at home. We have extremely low interest rates, and that's certainly helping, I think, as well. And so I think those kinds of factors. That's probably about it for my list of silver linings, other than perhaps, and this is like a secondary effect, getting back to what Christine said, which is that if in fact this prompts the American public to elect Joe Biden president, and we get a $2 trillion package for stimulus next year, which is heavily focused on clean energy and energy generally, I think that would obviously be a very big shot in the arm for the industry overall. But that's, to my mind, very much of a secondary effect. And the last thing I'll say is that I do think that this issue around financing readjustment rates is a real one, and one we'd want to continue to keep an eye on. You're exactly right, Chris, that in the 2008-2009 recession, essentially the spigots just closed for tax equity one day, and the government stepped in to provide, a support. That hasn't happened, but I would say that they've tightened up a bit, and it's not, these decisions will get made by major financial institutions, really quarter by quarter, I would imagine, as we get into next year. And so I think that's certainly something that to keep an eye on for
sure. I would add to that to the degree that some financial institutions have continued to have taxable earnings, some looming questions for me are what happens once we fully felt the impacts of, the fall off in enhanced unemployment benefits and the reduced consumer spending there and the reduced ability to pay mortgages on time and that sort of thing. I mean, that could hit financial institutions in a way that trickles down to the ability to finance renewables projects that rely on tax equity. So I think, Christine, Chris, Ethan, you're all right. It's different than 2008 and 2009, but we're seeing some of the same patterns without the same direct federal support.
Okay, thanks. Do you have anything, Chris, you want to add to discussion of silver linings in general, or the finance in particular?
I think the other panelists kind of covered this one. This hits an angle that is probably outside sort of the realm of PJM. So yeah, I think they covered it well.
Okay. I'll give you one then that I think is more in the realm of PJM and your concerns. That you mentioned the shift to between commercial and residential. There's also noted in at least parts of the country, maybe in general, that EVs are starting to take off a little bit. So the combined, when you sort of sort all of this out, you would expect things like the load shape to change and maybe even change the peak, because right now the peak is sort of the result of the overlap between commercial and residential. It occurs when some people are still at work and some people are coming home and some people are going out to the grocery store and whatnot. And if that all shifts and then people are charging up their cars when they get home or things like that, do you see any long-term, shifts or accelerating trends towards shifting of when peaks occur or how the load shapes? And as a follow-on to that, do you see that affecting sort of the economics of what would make sense as a resource to serve that peak? Is solar, for example, may or may not hit the peak in many places because it's has a very specific time of day shape, and shifting of peak earlier might help solar, later might hurt solar, things like that.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great thought, great line of sort of question there. So we actually did see some initial changes, even immediately from when the sort of pandemic first hit. I don't know if you're like myself. I used to get up much earlier in the morning, but now that we're working remotely, I'm still online at work at the same time, but I probably get up an hour later, an hour and a half later than I used to get up in the morning. So, and I think a lot of people were doing that. So we actually saw that shift where a morning, we sort of call it a morning ramp, where the load and the demand starts to increase, shifted to the right by about an hour. So that was a bit of a shorter term type of an impact there. But thinking longer term and some of the impacts that it can have to our capacity market, the way we sort of determine the amount of capacity we need today is really looking at the peak. And the peak is driven by what the demand is. So that's really the peak amount of energy you need is based on the peak demand at the time. But what we're seeing now is as we have resources, more and more of them, that are not always available. They're not 24-hour resources, so there's different intermittency, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's storage, or any other type of renewable resource. They're intermittent. So at the peak of the day, you may not have that capacity. So we've started to shift a little bit. And there was a comment I saw in the chat there about impacts of the FERC Order 841 incenting more storage. So we are seeing in our longer-term queues of new generation, still natural gas, solar, and batteries. And the further out queues are seeing more and more batteries start to come in now. So what that's really made us realize is taking a look and trying to procure capacity 3 years ahead of time, which is what we currently do. Just looking at the peak hour probably isn't sufficient anymore. So we've been using or just started using a new method, and we should not clear an auction using this method yet, called the Effective Load Carrying Capability, or ELCC. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's been around for decades as a concept, but really trying to look and say, what are the hours that have the most risk where you're not able to serve load? And that can shift. Historically, it's been the peak hour, but at least in the PJM territory, that's started to change. Other areas of the country that have much higher levels of renewables already may have some of this in place. But we're seeing that sort of changing model, not just looking at the peak hour, but really looking at all hours of the day, finding where is the most risk and what resources are able to help manage and mitigate that risk. And when you have resources, every resource has a trade-off. Some of them may be, they're there 24 hours, but they're going to be high polluting type resources. So that's a downside. Wind and solar, non-polluting resources, not there all hours of the day. Storage resources can ramp up and down at a moment's notice. Extremely great flexibility, which is excellent for trying to maintain reliability of the system. But again, they need to have a time to charge before they can discharge the energy. So all of those complexities, along with any potential changes of longer term for human behavior, probably not going to have too much of an impact on the demand shape itself. But when you think about the amount of demand you have to serve with varying resources, that's where we're really starting to make some of those changes to look at it more from an hourly type perspective and get the right balance. We have the right mix of resources to be able to reliably maintain the system, which is going to include more and more renewables, more and more storage.
I need to take myself off mute before I speak. Do you see any impact from the EVs, or are you planning for any impact, how that might affect the whole dispatch and capacity mix?
Yeah, that's one of the items that our longer-term planners have started to look at. It'll be interesting to see, again, sort of back to previous comments about who's in office next, listening into some of the Democrats' plans, some of Biden's plans with converting, I think, the federal fleet to electric. So, and installing a significant number of electric charging stations around the country. If that does start to materialize, that's going to have a pretty big impact. So we're going to need to figure out exactly how that works. We've actually already, sort of interestingly enough, piloted some programs where we utilize those resources as they're connected to the grid to be able to provide, we call ancillary services. So being able to not only charge from the grid, but also inject power into the grid as well. So there's actually some additional opportunities from a market's perspective to utilize those resources. But yeah, definitely there will be changes if everybody comes home and everybody's plugging their vehicles in at the same time when they're returning from work. It's going to have a change to our evening peak shape. Whether it happens then, whether it happens overnight, are all items that we're considering. Not seeing huge impacts in the very near term. I think in the next 2 years or so, but getting beyond that, that's where we're going to have to really start taking a hard look at where are we going 10 years, 15 years from now, outside the scope of where our capacity market clears today. But those are definitely things that we think are going to be happening. We're going to have to be able to manage.
Thanks, Justin. You want to comment on sort of how load shifting, either as a result of the economic disruption and the disruption in work patterns, or the addition of EVs into the fleet, is going to impact sort of how solar fits into the market?
Sure. I mean, I think there's load shifting to the home that creates interest in home solar. I think the battery thing was a trend before this anyhow. Like we started seeing a year or two ago, a really sharp increase in the number of utility scale plants that were incorporating storage as part of their base offering, and a number of utilities are asking for it, and it added value. And so we are going to see more of that. And then on the residential side, I saw someone ask about this as well. I mean, we had already seen an uptick in interest in home batteries as a backup. I think that the pandemic coupled with the public safety power shutoffs is accelerating that. But some of those are confined to certain states, so California and Hawaii being, sort of peak interest areas, and but that's spreading out into other parts of the Southwest, and we'll start seeing it more in other parts of the country, particularly if you're in a place that has more reliability issues, or if you're really far out, in the more rural areas where it's a bigger issue. We'll see that. But, the battery prices are, getting closer to competing with, standard, home backup generator or backup for commercial purposes. I mean, we're still a little ways off, but, these things can all help with demand charge management, and there's a lot of value to be had there, both for individual customers, for utilities, for utility scale power producers, and this change in load shape, I think probably doesn't create any challenges that weren't already being solved with the preparation for higher renewables penetration. And so I think that it's going to be relatively straightforward for us all to adapt to that.
Okay. Ethan, Christy, you have anything to add to those responses? Okay. Let's see. Sort of a question about sort of the response of energy markets in general in previous natural disasters, specifically some hurricanes that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, especially like 2005 was a particularly bad year, and those really rocked energy prices, and are comparing the response of back then to 15 years ago to now. Is the increased use of fracking, natural gas, wind generation, solar generation, are these the most critical reasons sort of causing a difference in response of energy markets, or are there other factors at work now that weren't at work then? I'll start with Christy.
Well, I think there's a bit of, certainly the new structural pricing level in natural gas that has been realized through the lower expenses associated with fracking has been extremely constructive. But I also think that it's important to note that, to their credit, the renewable technology sector chased gas down every step of that leg down in price. And I think that going forward, that's going to help operate to keep a cap on power prices to a significant extent, because the decline in natural gas prices, when a lot of these supported programs were initially rolled out, the structural price of gas was assumed to be north of $4, probably somewhere between $6 and $8, and not in the $2.50 to $3.50 level we've seen for the last almost decade now. And I think that, to their credit, the renewable energy industries have really chased natural gas down that cost curve and have become a lot more competitive, and that's going to keep the pressure on prices. Now, the other thing we saw that I think is also very relevant is that, when the Clean Power Plan was stayed by the Supreme Court, then a big driver for what was expected to be an environmental regulation driving a portfolio rotation didn't happen. We've had a lot of emissions reductions. In fact, we've had almost all of the emissions reductions that were initially anticipated by EPA during the first years of that program have come to pass through a number of things. But what we do have is we haven't really had the efficient exit that might have been better facilitated by that regulatory program that would have made it easier to get some older assets out of the stack. And so we not only have, moderately priced natural gas, which is great. We have an increasingly competitive renewable energy industry, which is great for consumers as well. But we also have a bit of structural oversupply. Chris is probably familiar better than anyone on earth with, the challenges you have when you have, a lot of generation available and none of it really feels like it's as profitable as it would hope to be. And so if you have a lot of oversupply too, you have a challenge as well. So I think it's a confluence of events. I also think that, while it's really hard to elucidate concretely, the energy efficiency standards that were adopted in the 2007 ERISA also have made a difference, and we continually become more energy efficient as an economy, and that means we grow with less energy demand per unit of GDP. So I think those other factors are also relevant.
Thanks. Ethan, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I would agree with everything. I guess the only slight thing I would take issue with is I sort of maintain that I don't think that the Clean Power Plan would have been a difference maker. I think we kind of felt in BNEF, we've always had a pretty optimistic view about renewables, and so I think we felt that was, these goals were going to get kind of met anyway. And so clearly politically the fight around that has been important, but I don't know that it's driven the market as much as cheap natural gas has, the inevitable decline in renewable prices. But I would say maybe more importantly, maybe just look ahead. The one thing that I would raise as a sort of small red flag is, we are seeing in the U.S. oil production has dropped now in the last 6 months in response to global conditions by I think about 20% more or less. And there's a fair amount of gas, associated gas, produced at oil wells. There's also, to be clear, there's plenty of gas that comes that's just purely taken out of the ground in, closer to Ohio, West Virginia, places like that. But there's an amount that's associated with oil production as well. If we see a very dramatic decline in oil production, it could put some upward pressure on natural gas prices, which in turn could put some upward pressure on power prices. That's looking a couple steps down the road, I realize, but I think that's something maybe just to keep in mind. And this is what the area where there is some interplay. I mean, often when you talk to non-energy people, you have to kind of make sure they understand that there's the oil markets over here and there's power markets over here, but this is kind of the place where there's a little bit of interplay between these two things in a kind of meaningful way.
Do you think that pressure from the loss of associated production would be enough to sort of push what Christy said, sort of it used to be that people thought of $4 as being the natural, equilibrium point for natural gas prices, and now it's looking more like $2.50, maybe $3. Is loss of associated production enough to push it back up to the $4 range, or?
To be clear, I'm speculating. I don't think this is sort of an overnight kind of thing. I just think it's something that we should all probably watch, because I think there is some potential impact to push it closer up to, our house view is generally going to stay around 2 for a long time, but, oil could have some impact and drive us up to 3 or 4. Who knows? Maybe even higher.
Okay. Chris, Justin, anything to add there? I'll move on to some of the questions from the attendees. There's a question about mergers and acquisitions, and to what extent is a lot of the newer trends, the emerging trends we've been talking about in terms of batteries and solar, going to sort of affect the landscape in terms of having even larger utilities, or maybe more RTOs, or maybe even to bring back the hot topic of maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the utility debt spiral, where the old business model for utilities no longer seems to work. I'll start with Justin on that.
Well, I guess I don't have a whole lot to say about that, other than, load growth from EVs seems like a pretty good thing for everyone involved in the power sector.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
I'll just say real quick, I think, generally it's been a tough time to be an independent power producer and a power plant owner overall over the last several years. And I think that these mergers, at least to my mind, or potential mergers, is indicative of a desire to get closer to customers, and also potentially, as Justin alludes to, get closer to some of the trends that might be happening more at the residential level, and being able to capitalize on some of those things. I frankly, from a consumer point of view, don't think it's necessarily a great thing to have other bigger mergers to utilities. But I think that may be one of the things that's driving.
Chris, do you see the sort of a material change in the markets going on that might affect sort of the ability of participants in PJM to, their sort of pressures to consolidate operations or otherwise reorganize themselves? Or is that
Haven't seen it so much in PJM, but this week certainly there was talk that NextEra was shopping again. Had sent some dozen roses over to Duke, and Duke wasn't particularly enchanted by at least the particular dozen that came over. So I think that there's questions about, certainly there's when there's a perceived opportunity, then there is the potential for transactions. This is not the first time NextEra has been shopping, so they tried to, I think they made a play for the Hawaii utility. They were in the mix when Oncor was on the block. So, it's something that may be a little more driven by their expectations or their desire to keep growing. But it depends on which market you're in. I mean, I think consolidation in some respects between utilities is easier in an RTO because you do have this the separation of the transmission operations and an ability to argue that the ability to prefer your own generation is impeded by the independent market operator that is present there. In the Southeast, it would be more complicated. I think you get back into standard antitrust stuff. You will have a big filing not only at FERC but at the Federal Trade Commission. And, when you look at some of the trends that are going on in the Southeast, and and I'm certainly not the axe on this, Ethan, and Justin, I'm sure, have a better view on this than I do. I don't think the folks who are advocating for more competitive generation supply would be wildly excited to see that sort of consolidation, especially with the implication, as was suggested in some of the reporting on the NextEra Duke tie-up, that the whole idea would be to basically bring it all in-house and find a new customer for NextEra stuff. And I think that is not something, I think that's something that comes back to a bit of a conversation we haven't had in a little while, in part because, as Ethan and Justin mentioned, we don't have so many independent power producers publicly traded anymore, so you don't quite see that challenge as readily. But in the electric utility industry, there's certainly been this tension between David and Goliath, that the Goliath would be the electric utilities, and that they are not necessarily always the best deal for their customers, although they do have regulators that make sure the deal is pretty decent. But I think that it would be, if you look at a big tie-up in the Southeast, that one in particular could have some challenges, not because it would be an impediment to the rollout of clean technologies, but because it would run into other structural parochial issues, if you will, in this space.
Thanks. So we have a number of questions I see related to renewables policies and renewable subsidies. I'm going to generalize that some and actually direct the next question to Chris Pylon related to a lot of the clean energy subsidies or the zero emissions credit subsidies that are going on in a lot of the PJM footprint and the policy impact that that's had on, especially with the FERC MOPR rule. Do you see policies continuing? How do you see that playing out in terms of, we've seen the wave of coal retirements. Are there any long-term impacts to the capacity mix that you see from implementation of that?
Yeah, sure. You touched on this a little bit. See, there's been a bit of a hot topic, and it's sort of, I guess, in line with one of the comments that Christina made earlier about sort of the efficient exit of resources, and that's hard to do when you've got the sort of political pressures and the political visibility when you think about somebody, elected politician, running for office and a major coal plant that employs hundreds of people or a nuclear plant that employs thousands of people. It's no longer economically viable for whatever reasons that may be. It could be an older technology that is just high costs. The demand may not be there for it. But when then it comes to actually retiring that resource, that impacts the local community significantly. And there can be other benefits too outside of the local community, especially if you're talking with nuclear, where you don't have quite the same level of emissions. You've obviously got the spent fuel to deal with, but there is also that sort of perspective and angle on it as well. And then the result is locally they don't want the resource to retire, even though the market says retire. So rather than retiring it, it needs to be subsidized. You need to find a way for the resource to recover the costs of operating, as well as to make a little bit of a profit there. But you can't have people going into work and they don't have a source of income. They're not going to stay there working. So that's where you end up with this inefficiency in the market, where if we clear our market and let's say there's 2,000 megawatts of generation that really doesn't clear, it should retire, yet then it's subsidized and now it stays in the market. Well, okay, now we have 2,000 megawatts of extra generation that we don't need, we're not paying for, it's being subsidized outside the market. So that just serves to really incorrectly drive down some prices. Now you've got a mismatch between really what should be happening and really what should be happening is, while resources, they're going to have to retire at some point. You do need to have that turnover. So older, inefficient technologies are leaving. Newer, more efficient technologies, lower cost, are entering. You should have a proper balance of that. And the subsidies really kind of just throw a big monkey wrench into all of that. And it's been having a pretty substantial impact in some areas of the market. So it's something we've been continuing to work with. It's continuing to be a topic of discussion at the federal level as well as at the state level. So some of the things we're trying to do is obviously outreach to all of those impacted parties and see is the market set up and designed to do what it should be doing? And our design had been provide energy at the lowest cost. That's the guiding principle. But if there are other guiding principles at even a state level, thinking about renewable targets, things like that, does that need to be included in the market somehow? So those are some of the discussions we're having, because we need to make sure that the market is clearing basically what the customers want. And the customers used to want the energy at the cheapest price. That's not always the answer now. I think some people are willing to say, hey, I'll pay a little bit more if it's going to be clean energy, as an example. You may have seen those things come through the mail to you from your local utility. So we know those changes are out there, sort of from a public perspective. Now it's a matter of how do we reconcile all of this? And we don't have the solution at this point, but continuing to work towards that, and that is definitely shaping a lot of the discussions in our capacity energy markets as well.
Thanks. Anyone else want to comment on not necessarily the MOPR policy, but policies that they see as being impactful that are coming on the horizon, the expiration of tax credits for renewables or other state, federal level policies?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that part of the, sort of drag on recovery for solar and, potentially much faster growth is this uncertainty around the investment tax credit step down. We're at 26% now. We're going to be at 22% next year. After that, it drops to 0 for direct ownership residential and 10% for, commercial and utility. And so, that creates, a challenge for the industry. Our prices are coming down, and, it's not a question of whether or not the industry will continue to exist. It will. I think we've crossed a tipping point to a certain degree that, solar is competitive, but it does reduce the potential for growth. And, for climate goals, if not, just for employment goals, I think we would all like to see solar grow a lot faster and, have the opportunity to provide new jobs where, a 50 or 60-year-old plant that, at some point does need to retire, that there are going to be other energy opportunities out there. And so, we certainly see a lot of growth potential if, we address the tax equity issues and look at a longer run for the ITC.
Quick follow-up, Justin. You mentioned the ITC and the split between it going away entirely for direct ownership versus staying at 10% for the owned by businesses component of that. Initially, when the wave of residential PV first sort of started, it was sort of the result of or led by companies that had sort of a lease model, and they would build the panel and own it, and then they would have some arrangement with the customer to pay for the power or whatever. But there was a sort of movement away from that. I'm not quite sure where it stands now, but do you see that the fact that the Lend-Lease people will have essentially or third-party ownership people will essentially have a 10% cost advantage on the installation as presaging sort of a shift back to that ownership model, assuming that policy plays through as on the books?
I mean, I don't think there's any really one right answer for that. I mean, there's room for both, particularly considering, some states you still can't really do third-party ownership. And so those places you're going to continue to see, purely loan and cash sales for distributed generation. And as for, how much of a difference 10% credit makes, particularly as costs are falling, there are transaction costs also associated with getting tax equity. So, I think overall it's just the bigger issue is that the pie is going to shrink more so than what the mix of the pie is going to be.
Okay. Ethan, do you look like you have something you want to say about the policy issues?
Well, just only on the ITC. I mean, I think we agree that it'll put a crimp in the solar market in the short run, but we're extremely optimistic in the long run that given what we've seen with the pricing on EVs globally, that eventually we see enormous growth. And eventually, our long-term projection is if we get to something like 120 gigawatts of distributed PV by 2040. So, it's going to happen one way or the other. The ITC step down is not great news for the industry, but our view is in the long run, kind of get where we're going anyway, eventually.
Chris, do you have anything to add about policies that you see being impactful going forward?
Yes, there's one thing we haven't touched on or haven't talked about a lot here today, and that is a more tangential policy, and that is actually the drive of investors to push companies into more ESG stances, which ESG standing for environmental, social, and governance approaches to their investments. And one of the things that is continuing to drive, certainly some larger commercial installations has been this pressure on companies away from the energy sector to green up their energy portfolio and they've done it, we've seen a lot of it with the technology companies in terms of seeking to fully offset their energy usage with green usage, the Amazons of the world and the Microsofts pushing forward for that kind of thing. And so I think that is something else that also continues to foster. It's a policy perspective, but not really a government-driven policy perspective as much as it is this ESG movement that is becoming more and more focused on moving forward with a lighter footprint on the environment overall, and that makes us continue to think that to Justin's point, that the tax equity market won't completely evaporate. The banks may not necessarily need to offset their taxes, but hopefully other industrial companies will continue to move that direction and, need to green up their, not necessarily through tax equity support, but through procurements that would, support projects, even if there's a little bit, as Chris mentioned, a little bit higher cost associated with those because of the overall strategic focus.
Chris, just jump in and say obviously one of the beauties of being at home, that you can look things up on your computer while other people are talking. But exactly to Christine's point is just to give some numbers around that. We saw about 16 gigawatts of corporate PPAs signed in the Americas last year, mostly in the United States, and that was up from about 9 the year before. It was a record, and about 20 total gigawatts of corporate PPAs for renewables last year. So that's exactly right. The market has been growing. Although I will say that is one area that for this year is probably going to take a hit, in part because of COVID. And so far, through the first 3 quarters of this year, we've had about 8 gigawatts in the Americas, again, mostly in the U.S. So we'll probably end the year actually down just a little bit from last year. But generally speaking, when you look at the total number of commitments that have been made under the RE100 and other types of things, there's a lot of corporate demand kind of built in over the next year.
So I want to segue a little bit sort of from that discussion of companies from outside the energy sector with their ESG policies to focus on a slightly different angle on that, and that's companies such as from the oil and gas industry, BP or whatever, who have now decided they want to diversify their energy portfolio and are starting to try and make headway into the wind and solar market. How do you see that as a potential disruptor or agent of change in the electric power sector? As Ethan, I'll take anyone who wants to respond, but
I guess I'll go first. I hope others will speak up too. I mean, just generally speaking, the volumes of capital that these companies bring into the sector obviously is enormous, and that has the potential to, as our earlier conversation about availability of capital for projects. BP just got into partnership, put $1 billion into partnering on an offshore wind project in the Northeast. So that's generally, I'd say, good. It's bad, again, getting back to the old model of IPPs and or backed by private equity, money, which is expecting 10, 15, 20% rates of return. These projects are going to generally kick out returns more like 5 to 10%, and that's something like a BP can take on potentially, as can NL or some of the other international utilities that have become U.S. developers essentially over the last 5 years. So I think that's generally good for U.S. power. One thing I will say is that I am curious to see how BP's investors and investors in Total and Shell, those three in particular, because of the commitments that they've made around electricity, how they will view those companies going forward. Because as you guys know who operate in the power sector, the returns that you earn on power projects, while often safer and more reliable, are generally often not as high as what you get in oil and gas exploration. And whether or not the investors in these companies fully understand that and are comfortable with that, I think those are open questions for them to think about.
Well, I think Ethan makes an important point when it comes to the cost of capital. It's not necessarily always the absolute number, that is magical. It's the risk reward, and as Ethan said, there's a willingness to put money to work when when it's perceived to be or can be risk mitigated and is considered to be more stable and more reliable. So as long as you have a PPA that actually endures and you don't wind up signing it with a utility company that goes bankrupt and seeks to reject it, then you're really usually in pretty good shape. So I think that, there's been quite a bit of conversation about marrying up the offshore oil industry with the offshore wind industry, bringing exactly the expertise and working in particularly adverse environments and managing rigs that, that float, and bringing the two technologies together in order to, to make the whole industry grow faster is something that's been, I think it's been in the wind for a couple of years in terms of conversation. Sorry about the incredibly bad pun. But I think that there is an interest. I mean, there's a shift in where economies are going and where corporates are being driven in terms of their social bargain, in terms of being more considerate of interests beyond simply the bottom line of their owners, but this ESG stewardship issue, what is their role in society more generally? And I think that seeking a more benign impact on the environment is a part of that that's not necessarily going to go away. Now, I think that, it is not unfair. Some folks think that this is greenwashing, and in some respects I would say that there's evidence that there have been projects that represent that particular pejorative. But I think that, you are seeing, diversification, and it's about risk. You can't have all of your eggs in one basket. And if petroleum is something that is, being identified as a component of the economy that governments and now corporations are increasingly trying to, to migrate away from, then it would seem that if you had any sense of fiduciary responsibility at all, you'd be trying to get more on board with that trend if it doesn't look like it's going to stop.
So we saw maybe 10 years ago or so indications from the financial community that they, at least a few high-profile actors came out and said, we're not going to finance coal plants anymore, and that I think has kind of built up over the years. Do we see that happening now with gas, or do you see the potential of that happening now with both gas plants and maybe even gas projects where they're, because of the whole ESG movement, the banks, the financial community might be more reluctant to even back natural gas as a long-term generation profile portfolio risk?
Well, we certainly haven't seen it firsthand in terms of the natural gas yet. I think that there's still, given the alignment of sort of the industrial complex and what we have invested in terms of engines and supply and that sort of thing, I think that it is easier to take the emissions moral high road when it comes to oil and gas than it is on natural gas at this point. But, given how unusual the world is and where trends are going, it's, it would appear foolhardy to rule it out. But there's still a lot of work being done, throughout the fossil complex on, trying to make the solution in terms of can you come up with something that makes sense on carbon capture that could manage the continuation of making use of fossil fuels, given the fact that they do have some wonderful energy density when it comes to just what they store in their natural form. That I think that, the thing that could be a real game changer is if there is a breakthrough on that makes it more affordable financially. And it may not save coal per se because of the trend away from coal, not only on the emissions basis, but because of the other environmental consequences of mining. But with the lighter touch of fracking compared to conventional exploration and stuff like that, I think that if you got a CCS solution, it would probably disproportionately benefit natural gas.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I'll offer a jaded view on all this, which is, I think.
Oh, good. Stop agreeing with me.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think I'm going to agree with you. But anyway, my jaded view on it is that financial institutions tend to agree to stop financing things once they realize those things don't make any money. And so the push on coal became pretty easy, several years ago. No one wants to finance coal anyway. They're not going to make them any money. So it's pretty easy to put out a press release and pat yourself on the back for it. We're definitely seeing a bit more of that around oil exploration, but even that's getting a little bit easier when you have companies like BP and others, acknowledging that we might be reaching, or have reached some kind of peak in oil demand globally. Natural gas is going to be a different one, I think, potentially. Or let's put it this way: we're not there yet with natural gas, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next 12 months, because clearly the environmental community is putting natural gas in its sights. Nat gas is the number one emitter of CO2, I believe, in the power sector, and because it's now more or less double of coal generation. It's just about there. That raises its profile. That gets it more on the hit list of the enviros, and that raises some pressure. And so there'll be more pressure on regulation, potentially, again, depending on the election. And then eventually that might come back to more pressure on financial institutions. But I don't, right at this moment, and I'm agreeing with Christina, I don't really see the banks backing off gas at the moment yet.
All right. Going to change tracks kind of quick. I think we got time for maybe one more round of responses here. I'm going to shift to, we had a question on offshore wind, offshore renewables. I'm going to start with Chris Pylong to I believe there are a couple of projects, offshore wind projects, that are sort of in the works in the PJM footprint or around there. Do you see a pickup or drop off in interest in offshore wind? Is that going to be a player in the near to midterm future in PJM?
I think it definitely will. There's actually, I think they're in the initial stages of what's going to ultimately be about a 2,600 megawatt offshore wind farm connecting in off of the Virginia Beach area. Just seeing some information the other day that's just beginning its pilot phase, so it'll still be a few years, but they're ramping up construction on that one fairly quickly. I think so. There's kind of probably two drivers here. The first being the state mandates, the state renewable portfolios. Virginia is very aggressive. You've probably seen what they put out in the Virginia Clean Economy Act, looking for certain amounts of onshore, offshore wind and storage as a big driver there. I think we'll see some off of the coast of New Jersey. There's been interest there. They're under development it's not the PJM territory, but up in New England as well. I think, too, I mentioned earlier our shift from a capacity perspective of using that ELCC model. So for PJM, traditionally, a wind farm, we have no offshore wind farms, and we just had a static factor of 13% for wind resources. That's the capacity that they could clear. So a 100 megawatt wind farm would only be paid and really cleared for 13 megawatts of capacity. With the ELCC model, that actually is giving us more flexibility for onshore and offshore wind too. So offshore wind is most likely going to have a higher ELCC value, meaning it can clear at a higher megawatt output than onshore wind, mainly because if you've been out on the ocean, the wind is pretty much always blowing. So the capacity factor would be much higher there, unless there's major weather conditions that would have the unit shut down. So sort of between the state mandates and some of the laws that are out there, as well as having a higher capacity factor in our market, that's going to help. That said, it's still a lot more costly to try to deliver the wind energy from out in the middle of the ocean, have those turbines able to withstand all of the elements that they have to deal with out there, as opposed to a wind farm that is located inland and is physically more close to the electric grid. Typically, what we see is the wires sort of get thinner as we get towards the edges of the system down towards the shore points. So it can be a little bit more difficult to interconnect in, a little bit more costly to interconnect in, as well as that lengthy line that may be several miles long running under the ocean floor there. So they're all higher costs. So whether that offsets the increased ELCC value, we'll see. But we are seeing that there are some substantial ones in our queue.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the prospects for offshore wind domestically or internationally?
I'll just say there's been about 10 head fakes for offshore wind in the U.S. in the 20 years that I've been kind of in this business. And but this time I think it's real. It feels like there's real money, there's real development, there's real commitment from regulators. So we're quite optimistic. We're projecting about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. It's pretty bullish on life, but we think it's going to happen.
Okay. I think with that, we're just about out of time, so I would like to again thank all of our panelists, Christy, Chris, Ethan, Justin. Thank you very much. Hand clap, and Kelsey's going to be putting up. Yeah. So thanks for everybody who called in today to listen and ask your interesting questions and contribute to what I thought was a very interesting and informative discussion. I know it will help EIA, and I hope it helped all of you as well. Thank you if you joined in our previous workshops on macro demand and the petroleum natural gas one earlier this week. I would point out that there will be a transcript or the recordings, and to the extent there are presentations, slides for any of these will be posted on our website at the address shown. Once again, they need to be closed captioned before we can post them, so it might be, a short delay. But if you have any follow-up questions, please email our annual Energy Outlook at EIA.gov email address. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of the day. I don't know how it is where everybody else is, but it's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., so get out and enjoy it.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.